Israel enters the Jewish high holiday season under lockdown. It's the government's attempt to keep infection numbers down as they continue rocketing to record highs. Around 5,000 new confirmed cases per day, and more than 1 in 10 Israelis testing positive.
Let's just say it's been a crazy few months, to say the least. To put things into perspective, when we first started working on this episode, we were celebrating Passover under a nationwide lockdown here in Israel. And while we've been able to keep the virus at bay for a couple of months, we just celebrated the holiday of Sukkot with a second lockdown. As we slowly adjust to whatever this new norm is here and around the world, we've come to the realization that diplomacy may never be the same. So how did we get here? Where are we now? And what does the future hold for the world of global affairs and diplomacy down the line? All this and more on this special episode, Corona Non-Grata. This is Persona Grata, the official podcast of the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm your host, Tamar Schwartzbard. When we started brainstorming about our second season of our podcast, we never could have imagined that our first episode would be dealing with a full-blown pandemic. Most of the conversations you'll hear in this episode were recorded via Zoom or Skype because, well, coronavirus. Hi, Peleg? Peleg, can you hear me? Let's start by going back to January, when the coronavirus was at its height in China, but hadn't spread globally yet.
Actually, the virus caught us on surprise.
Like millions of other Chinese residents, Peleg Levi, Israel's Consul General in Guangzhou, didn't plan on celebrating the Chinese New Year under a strict lockdown. But then again, he probably could have never imagined that he'd be serving as Israel's representative in the heart of a pandemic. So how did we get here? On December 31st, the last day of 2019, China reported a number of unusual pneumonia cases in the city of Wuhan, home to 11 million people. What started off as a mysterious virus which affected a few people, overnight became a full-blown epidemic, which the world hadn't seen since the Spanish influenza nearly a century before.
It was the eve of the Chinese New Year, and I'm talking about the first 24 to 48 hours. All the sources were unreliable or very vague, so we had to make a lot of decisions. The decision making was very, very hard to make. So therefore, we did not know what would be the case, and we prepared ourselves very quickly for the worst case scenario, which is like The Walking Dead, basically. We got the notion or the decision that it might be serious, and therefore, first thing we did is to evacuate those who wanted in the consulate, and of course, we're talking about the family members and the non-essential staff. That we had the decision. It was very difficult because, as we said, it was the eve of New Year's. Everything was closed down. Logistically, it was a nightmare.
And then the phone calls started pouring in. Thousands of Israelis in southern China began contacting the consulate and received recommendations to go back to Israel immediately.
You know, Israelis, they contact you before it even happens. In South China, there are around 1,000, 2,000 Israelis that are working and living here on permanent time, and of course, many tourists, etc. All of them immediately starting connecting with us through the WeChat, which is the local application, and asking for information and asking for advice. And it took a few days until the Israeli authorities back home in Jerusalem made the official declaration that recommended Israel to evacuate.
But at the beginning of January, Israelis weren't too concerned about the virus, which at this point was contained to China and the Asian continent. Yes, there were a few cases here and there, like the group of Israelis who contracted the virus on a Japanese cruise ship, but for the most part, for Israelis, the virus seemed far from home. And then came February, and the epidemic started to gain steam and spread across Europe, from country to country and embassy to embassy.
Everybody here was idle, life was going on as usual. The local government of Madrid decided to close all cultural establishments.
Rodica Radian Gordan, Israel's ambassador to Spain, heads one of the first Israeli missions to have been affected by the coronavirus. And by affected, we mean infected, with 60% of the embassy contracting the virus.
I remember the dates very vividly because around these times, we noticed that in the embassy, we had a few sick people. And it seemed to us that there were too many sick people to be sick at the same time. And we realized that something was very wrong. We decided that we had to close down the embassy and enter into self-confinement. After about 8 to 9 days, we had about 60% of our staff being sick.
And then the virus continued to spread.
You've seen the images. You've heard the numbers.
It has now killed at least 425 people.
636 people.
China says the death toll from the spreading coronavirus is now at 1,016.
My name is Shalvi, and I'm the deputy manager of the Israelis Abroad department.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do thank you very much for your attention, and now we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the takeoff. Thank you, and again, welcome aboard.
Here's the fun fact. In 2019, Israelis took more than 9 million trips abroad. And when you consider a country that's made up of a little less than 9 million citizens, that's a lot of Israelis abroad.
My department is taking care and to handle all the cases of the Israelis in distress abroad. It can be missing people or people that got hospitalized or some accidents, sick people, and sometimes we help bring some bodies back to Israel.
So what happens when hundreds of thousands of Israelis are abroad when an epidemic hits? Israel's Consular Division for Israelis Abroad found out for the first time.
So as you all know, it all started in China. Actually, we can say that beginning of March was the most, the massive calls and cases were started. And then we were required to put many efforts in the ministry, in our division, in the Consular Division, to give service to thousands of calls and every day that we got from all over the world and from Israel, from the families. And there were, some very hectic times. We had to work really, literally, 24/7. Many things that we had to handle in order to find a creative solution for Israelis to come back home when flights are canceled all over, borders are closed. There were, we estimate, around 10,000 Israelis, travelers, that were at these times abroad and wanted to come back home. And we really want to enable them to come back before Pesach, before Passover. And I can say that after many efforts and a lot of good work, most of them did come back home to celebrate with their families the holiday.
As Ziv mentioned, during the time that the coronavirus hit, there were 10,000 Israelis traveling abroad, majority of them young Israelis in their early 20s. So as you can imagine, there were lots of worried parents calling the Consular Division to bring their children home.
Well, we used to such calls, from worried parents. Sometimes they are, a bit too worried, sometimes hysterical as well. We understand that, and we have to contain all the energy and the worries about their kids abroad.
Obviously, it begins with a ring. And we pick up the phone. We usually pick up the phone within the 2, 3, 5 seconds. A phone call can be from the tiniest Caribbean island, from a distant African nation, or from a major diaspora hub, like the US or Australia.
The Situation Room at the Israel MFA is the hub for crisis management when a disaster or emergency situation arises which involves Israelis. On average, the Situation Room fields a couple hundred calls every month from Israelis stuck abroad who are in need of emergency assistance. but during Corona, operators were literally answering thousands of calls a day.
At the beginning, I'd say around January, the most massive fielding of calls began. We were receiving a few hundred calls a day, but by the time we hit mid-February, and up until around late April or mid-May when the situation was at its worst, we fielded upwards of 15,000 calls.
Like Ohad said, at the beginning of the crisis, the number of calls were pretty average. But as the virus began to spread and hit more and more countries, the Consular division began to understand that the situation was going to escalate.
Then we started contacting Israeli airlines companies like El Al, Israel, Arkia, and we started to check with them whether they can send special flights to bring back the Israelis. And then the big operation was done in Peru, where at 15th of March, the president of Peru said, okay, in 1 or 2 days, we're going to close completely the borders. At this time, thousands of Israelis, young Israelis, this is the season there, in Costco and other places, got caught in surprise, actually, because they did not have any chance to leave the place. So we did a very prompt, response with El Al, that at the beginning they said, okay, we can send one airplane, and we started registering all the Israeli travelers. In 24 hours, we got 1,100 Israelis registered. At the end of the day, with the great help of also our government, El Al sent 4 planes to Peru to bring 1,100 Israelis from there. In no time, it was like 48 hours, the planes were already there.
The cheers you just heard are from a group of very relieved young Israelis as they board the first rescue flight from Peru back home to Israel.
And then all over the world, we had operations. El Al sent 2 airplanes to Australia. I think it was the farthest trip of a El Al airplane ever. In Bolivia, for example, there were many Israelis there. And we had to use in this time our embassy in Brazil, help a lot to tailor a solution together with some private jets.
But when we talk about bringing Israelis home, we're not just talking about huge missions which bring home plane loads of young Israelis. We're talking about individual stories, like the Israeli who was stranded on a yacht in Jamaica, or the couple living in Ecuador whose baby needed to be flown to Israel for emergency heart surgery.
In Ecuador, in Quito, there was a family, a couple with the 2 babies. One of the babies had to have a very emergency surgery, I think in the heart. And it could be done in Israel, during this time in Israel only, and there was no flight to Israel. And they were very worried, of course. And the Department of the Israelis Abroad and the Consular Division managed to get some help. Someone sent them a private jet to bring them over to Israel. And they were shocked about the way that we could help, and we are very happy that we were able to help in this case. This is one very, small and little story, but there are so many of them. Thousands of Israelis need to come back home. Almost everyone has his own story. Someone is sick, someone has to be back home. They start losing their hope, start losing their mind, and flights are canceled, and sometimes, the ambassador coming there, visiting them, bring them food. I know there was one yacht that some Israeli was there in Jamaica, and the ambassador there in Santo Domingo, our ambassador helped and took care to bring them food every day.
People like to think of diplomacy as a glamorous field filled with cocktails and meet and greets, but we often forget that Israeli diplomats are on the front lines when it comes to crises and emergency situations. Many Israeli representatives remained in their host countries, even at the height of the coronavirus.
I consider myself the captain of this boat, and the captain leaves, the last. So for me, it was clear. It never crossed my mind that I have to stay here. I decided to stay here together with my partner, but the rest of the diplomats left. But for me, it was obvious that I'm going to stay. We don't say that we work in the foreign ministry, we serve at the foreign ministry. And I think that this is the time that I have to stay here, that I have to dedicate myself 100%.
Israeli representatives in countries hit hardest by the epidemic, like China, Spain, and Italy, didn't just limit their activity to helping Israelis. They worked in tandem with the Israel MFA headquarters and local authorities to offer their support and help in any way possible to the countries affected by the virus. Let's go back to March and April for a second. Here in Israel, we had already experienced a few cases of the coronavirus, which then rapidly spread, but at that point, the cases were relatively contained. We were in a position, through our diplomatic missions, to mobilize supplies, technology, and medical experts to assist countries overwhelmed by the pandemic.
We realized that because it was happening in parallel in so many countries, but also there was a very strong case of success on Israel's side on, the way that we dealt with COVID-19. Then it was very interesting for other countries, in this case for Spain, to also exchange views and to see how Israel is coping with the crisis, what we could learn from one another. What we did was establish a direct dialogue between the ministries of health. They had a very professional discussion on how each side confronted the crisis, what they thought they could have done in retrospect. But in the meantime, we also took the initiative of reaching out to local authorities in Spain, in different provinces, and offering dialogues and exchanges on a variety of issues, from health to a series of dialogues on problems of society that stem from the confinement, such as gender violence or psychological trauma or problem of young children or the elderly and so on. We had a very, very nice range of initiatives in culture. We had gestures of solidarity from Israel, starting with the phone call between our president and the King of Spain, lighting the building of Tel Aviv Mayorship Spanish flag. We had messages from sports figures from Israel to Spain and so on.
When we think about some of the most historical moments and achievements in the field of diplomacy, we automatically envision handshakes and photo ops between leaders. But in the age of Corona, handshakes are a thing of the past.
Good evening. Thank you for joining me for the first ever online Seder.
The Israel MFA and our missions found creative ways to move our activities online. From webinars to Spotify playlists to Passover Seders, our work didn't stop during the Corona pandemic. In fact, it only expanded. In May alone, at the height of the crisis, more than 106 million people were exposed to content we created at headquarters.
Don't forget that for here it's different in China because the platforms, the digital platforms are different. We don't have Facebook, we don't have Twitter. But people themselves, as I said, we reach new publics, people that were not online all the time. Now they are more online. We did a lot of webinars and a lot of online exhibitions, etc.
You probably already know this, but we at the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs are big fans of digital diplomacy. And content and online activity is probably the most basic tool that a diplomat in the 21st century needs. But at the same time, this period has taught us that digital diplomacy can never replace traditional diplomacy or the value of something as simple as a handshake, which about a year ago we used to take for granted.
Look, there's a debate going on between us diplomats of how effective we were. Digital possibilities permitted us to continue with the cooperation and to do actually also innovative things. But nevertheless, we all realize that there's a special place in diplomacy and in working on a one-to-one level or having, meeting people directly. And we really hope that by the time we get back to the new normality, we can also have physical meetings to support all the array of new subjects that we were able to develop during this time.
It's been about 10 months since the coronavirus changed our world. And if you've been following the numbers here in Israel and around the globe, we're not quite out of the woods yet. But as we look back, there are some important lessons that we've been able to take from this crazy experience. The first, the creative and innovative spirit that Israelis are known for, has probably been one of the biggest assets to our diplomats during this time.
Flexibility really helped us. Because if I compare myself to other diplomats, they have to wait for orders from headquarters and everything is very tough. In the Israeli state of mind of we're more flexible, we're more independent. So it really helped.
But the corona pandemic has also helped millions of people around the world see what's important in life. Family.
It's true also for our families in Israel that in the next few months cannot easily come and visit us. It has become more important for everybody, to at least try to see each other and talk to each other and feel close to each other.
Health.
At the end of the day, like our grandmother says, be healthy, that's the most important thing. Because this virus hit the wealthy countries and poor countries and rich people and poor people. And without your health, you're nothing.
And solidarity.
I think that in times of crisis, we find out a lot of good things about ourselves, because in the end, we have to cope with the situation. Everybody, at least from what I saw, got the best out of his and her character and experience. And I'm very proud of all of the staff here at this embassy. I think that this experience has brought us all closer together.
And the biggest lesson for Israelis, there's a big and beautiful world waiting to be explored, but there's no place like home.
We do hope we are doing our best for our citizens, and it's good to be Israeli in this time.
When we first started thinking about this episode, we had just completed a nationwide lockdown. And strangely enough, months later, we find ourselves in a lockdown again. Since this episode was recorded, there have been more than 1 million corona-related deaths around the world. Our thoughts, prayers, and wishes for a speedy recovery are with all who have been affected by this epidemic. But there's room for hope. In Israel and around the world, researchers and medical professionals are creating solutions to keep us safe and are closer than ever to finding a cure and vaccine to end this epidemic. Because of the coronavirus, many ministries of foreign affairs, including our own here in Israel, are more active than ever online. So if you're looking to keep up with our diplomats' work around the world and Israel-related news, feel free to follow us on Twitter @IsraelMFA and @Israel. Thank you for listening to this special episode of our podcast, Persona Grata, produced here in Jerusalem and edited by Ben Zabelshansky. Stay safe and healthy wherever you are.